So welcome everybody. I'm your host, Michael King. This is another inspirational interview on Artful Minds. If you're new to Artful Minds or you're curious about Artful Minds, we are an online community dedicated to the nurturing artistic talents and fostering creative growth among its members. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Our inspirational discussion today is with Pierre Coupey, a Canadian abstract artist, writer, poet, author, instructor, editor. He's done it all with over 6 decades of experience that include too many accolades to list. So welcome, Pierre. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. It's been a year in the works.
Pretty much, hasn't it? Yeah, that's right. And with this, I have about a dozen works that I want to bring up and start showing everybody. And while I'm scrolling through these works, if you can just tell us how you started painting abstract.
Well, of course, when I began painting in Montreal when I was in my early teens, well, it goes back before that. I always wanted to be a painter ever since I was 7 or 8. I knew it. And I was always drawing and stealing materials and doing everything I could on anything I could. But when I began to be a little bit more conscious when I was in my teens, and naturally at first I was doing figurative work and very much influenced by Modigliani and Matisse. I couldn't even begin to imagine tackling Picasso at that point, and maybe perhaps never, who knows. But I really was in love with painting from a very early age. And from a very early age, I realized that all painting is abstract, whether there's a figurative or a representational hook in it, whether it's an observational painting or a conceptual painting or an expressionist painting. No matter what it is, in the end, it's always abstract because it's, two-dimensional surface, and you're bringing that entire world from a three-dimensional world if you're a plein air painter and you're out there in the woods, in the forest, or next to a river or a lake, and you're having to put that down onto an 8x10 little piece of board, and it's two-dimensional. So you're abstracting, you're selecting, you're eliminating, and you're observing. No matter what you're doing, whether you're an observational painter, plein air, or an abstract painter, you're always in a process of very strict observation, because even as an abstractionist, you're observing the paint as it's going on, the paint as it's layering over time when the layers harden, and you're taking a lot of care. You're paying a lot of attention, even if it's quote unquote formal abstraction. But again, as a kid in Montreal, I was very lucky in that my father was a collector. I grew up with art in the house. I grew up with artists in the house. My parents were both very cultivated people, and I was exposed to literature and music and art from a very early age. And then I had the advantage of being able to walk to McGill and go down Sherbrooke Street and go into all the galleries on the way to my classes. And then I'd go to my classes, and when I was at university at McGill, and I'd take people out of class and we'd skip them and then go to the museums and the galleries. So I didn't have very much of an education. Even though I got my BA, I spent most of my time in the galleries. So, of course, in Montreal at that time in the 60s, the big people that you encountered were, of course, the artists of Refus Global, Paul-Émile Bourdieu, Jean-Paul Riopelle, who's being celebrated magnificently this year for his 100th anniversary, and then all the attendant figures in that group, Francois Sullivan, and what have you. And there were important galleries all along Montreal, all along Sherbrooke Street, where I could see contemporary abstraction being done and exhibited almost immediately after it was being done. And this was all contemporaneous with all the explosions of abstraction in the United States, especially in New York, with the so-called School of Abstract Expressionists, or the New York School. So it all felt revolutionary and enormously exciting and invigorating to me. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be like those guys, and women too. They were great artists. So does that give you a little bit of a hint?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's fantastic. I guess you could almost say that if it wasn't for the time and place that you were born and cultivated, you might have very much well been more of a figure painter, and whether it's in a Matisse style or or a still life painter, etc., really is really that drive for abstraction during your time that made you dive into it, I guess, right?
Yeah, of course, the stimulation around me was primarily abstract, but it doesn't mean that I don't find figuration interesting or compelling. There are a huge number of contemporary figurative painters that I follow very closely. I mean, can throw out the name of Peter Doig for one, and even here in Vancouver, Ben Reeves. I love his work, and so many that I love. And very often, my abstract paintings do begin with a still life or a figure, or even a rendition of Rembrandt's Polish Rider. I've done that as well. And then sometimes figures appear into the painting as you're painting, and then they disappear. So I don't see it as exclusive.
Okay, but I guess when they appear, it's a little more subconscious than it would be conscious, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure, yeah.
yeah.
But when you're painting, you're using every resource that you have. The other thing about abstraction, in terms of the way in which I approach it, which is not necessarily the way everyone approaches it, because we all have to find our own individual propulsions. For me, it's very much an act of the body, and I always break it down into three things. I mean, we are conceptual beings. We think, we have concepts, we have ideas. We're perceptual beings. We perceive the world through our five senses. But what's less tapped into in a conscious way is what's called proprioception. And we are proprioceptive beings. That is, the very fact that you're sitting on a chair is an exercise of proprioception. My sitting on a chair is an exercise of proprioception. My ability to reach my coffee cup without looking at it and bringing it to my lips and bringing it to my lips and drinking is an act of proprioception. And proprioception, the definition of that is sensibility within the organism by movement of its own tissue. So for me, painting is not merely a conceptual or not only a conceptual activity or only a perceptual activity, but it's a proprioceptive activity, a proprioceptual activity.
That's interesting. And I guess that's been developed over the years to be more automatic than it did when you were first starting out, correct?
I'm sorry, how does that?
Well, when we're children, we have to think about lifting that cup to bring it up to drink, right? And as we
Yeah,
progress through
well, we do
time, it's just
develop
an
what's called
automatic
body
thing.
memory.
Yeah. So I guess a lot of your painting now comes from the proprioception of your previous painting. It kind of just almost build themselves.
Well,
Yeah.
everything that you've done sort of begins to loop forward at different periods and times. But the other way of thinking about proprioception is that it's reenactment. That is, you absorb an experience or a complex of experiences, and instead of simply trying to depict them, you are reliving them. Just to illustrate this story, this way of thinking about painting, when Pollock was in a class with Hans Hofmann, and Hans Hofmann said, "You have to paint from nature." Pollock replied in disgust, "I am nature." And so it is a sense of painting from your nature, and of course, reenacting that world outside there, which we now call nature, which is now completely denatured and corrupted by our presence on it. But it is the world we inhabit. Anyway, worlds within worlds.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you argue with that statement, right? I mean,
Yeah, I am nature.
and so one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you is because I was being selfish because I have an ignorance that I need to fulfill because I can't remember how I came about you on Instagram, probably through mutual friends of ours. And I saw your paintings preparing for Echo's Bones, which is your show that you had last year, I believe, or earlier this year.
Yes, it was last January. Yeah.
Okay, that's that far ago. Wow. In
At
Gallery Jones.
Yeah.
And I kept on seeing your posts and I just said, I don't get it. I don't understand. And instead of dismissing it as no disrespect, make myself feel better, junk, I really wanted to get to know what was going on. And so I went to Gallery Jones. I went to see your exhibit. But even then I was looking at it and I still don't get it. I feel like I should get it. Being an artist.
Well, you don't have to get it.
Right?
No, that's the thing I learned early on. You don't have to get it because you get what you get, and the thing is that you're following up on a curiosity, and that is the most important thing. I mean, in the end, there is really nothing to get. It's all a mystery anyway, right? But there's nothing to conceptually understand in a kind of an equational way, right?
Yes.
This equals that. because that's not how the brain is working when you're looking at paintings or making paintings in that way. And so there are all kinds of things I can talk about in terms of those particular paintings. I mean, the text, the way in which they're made, the kind of layering that I'm after, and all of those separate strands can be, dissected, analyzed, but it still won't give you the gestalt. And the gestalt is finally, the juice you get from the thing yourself. It is ultimately the paintings that I want to see and that I respond to are the paintings that give me a sense of astonishment. And all I can say in their presence is, oh, or begin to weep, or to feel so overpowered by them that, it really is a physical sensation of being shattered. I will never forget the first time I saw Paul-Émile Bourgeois' fabulous painting 5+4+1, and in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And it was such a powerful experience that I fled the museum and I vomited on the front steps. I threw up.
Wow.
I had to, it kicked everything out of me. It kicked everything out of me. It kicked all my preconceived notions of what a painting could be out of me. And I still, of course, couldn't understand it, quote unquote, understand it. But I had a powerful physical reaction to it. And I knew that this is something that changed me in my at a molecular level. Now, at 80, how often do you get that kind of a kick in the gut that you have to leave the museum and puke?
Yeah, probably not that often. You've seen it all.
And, we're so blasé about everything anyway,
Yeah.
but it is that kind of intensity of experience where something is speaking to you so profoundly that you're not the same afterwards. But it can happen a quiet way too.
Yeah, and it can happen afterwards too,
It doesn't have to
because
be a volcano.
no, for sure, right? But you also provided a program with your Echoes Bone.
Yes, there was a brochure published with it. Yeah.
That's right. And it wasn't until I read that I started to garner appreciation of not just the artwork itself, but how you built it up. And then it got me down the rabbit hole of the mythical creature Echo and Narcissus and everything like that, which I had no clue at the beginning of this. I didn't even really know who Echo was.
Yeah.
And I think my lack of understanding of those characters in history or mythology really limited my take on the whole exhibit. So I appreciate you doing that program.
Yeah, well, that brochure was a lovely little publication, and the essay by Colin Brown was very good, and a work of art in and of itself, because of course he is a great poet and a great intelligence. But yeah, just to play with that a little bit, the title Echoes Bones came to me from the realm of literature. And of course, as you know, my background is also in writing and poetry and editing, and my work very often derives from or references literature or poems or alludes to it, and so the work is very elusive, and sometimes the titles can point you in that direction. But I just love the sound of that phrase, Echoes Bones. It was only until I began to do some research that I discovered that it was the title of a short story by Samuel Beckett. And then, of course, that it's based on the myth of Echo and Narcissus in some way.
Interesting.
And so there are all kinds of looping literary references that revolve and work through those particular paintings. And so they do involve myth. They do involve Ovid and Catullus and Samuel Beckett, but also very importantly, the poet Anne Carson. And so a lot of the words that the stenciled letters in those paintings are taken from Anne Carson's poetry and of course from Beckett, but then also from my own poetry. So they are a very kind of a camouflaged set of elegies.
That's right. And I'm just going to share some photos from that exhibit or some of the paintings. And I was going to ask you why the text, like some of them don't have text, some of them do.
Some of them don't have text, and
Yeah.
some of the text is even now to me completely illegible.
Yes, and it's really trying to find it and stuff like this. But I was wondering why it was there, and I guess it's to bring it in and tell more of the story that is untold.
Yeah, well, it's an interplay between the visible and the invisible. That's another way of looking at abstraction as well. I can't say always, but I very often, these are not the first paintings that have text in them or stenciled text. I've done quite a lot in the past. Sets of encaustic paintings, sets of graphite paintings, really graphite paintings that take text from poets like Charles Olson, etc. So I've always been, part of my origins as an artist and my practice is that offshoot of poetry called concrete poetry, with which you may be familiar. But concrete poetry or visual poetry, or and I'm forgetting the term right now. I wanted to bring it up earlier. I was practicing for it. It'll come back to me later. That's something that I've always been involved in since my teens. And so the way I wanted to learn how to make poems that proceeded like paintings. But now I find that I'm making paintings that proceed like poems. And so in poetry, even apart from visual poetry, concrete poetry, there's a thing called tone leading, where you take the lead from a syllable or a consonant or fragment of a word in a particular line, and it leads to another rhyming or non-rhyming word, so that it brings meaning into the poem that you are not anticipating. In other words, the unintended. It's not just the unconscious, because there's still something else at work there. But the unintended, the thing that we don't know, so that the reach is always to go from what we do know to what we don't know. And so I think in terms of my practice as an abstract painter that I'm very much working as a kind of an invisible poet. Even when there are words there or there are no words there, it is deriving from from poetics and a particular school of poetics, which now is out of fashion and not much studied any longer, but which for me remains very resonant and powerful.
Gotcha. So
sorry if I'm wandering on.
no, I love it. I love it. I can listen to you talk forever. The whole idea now is that I'm losing my train of thought here, but what you're talking about though, the development of poetry, etc. Can you equate that to what I read about building up Echo's Bone paintings by layer, letting layers be hidden but be seen?
Yes.
Could you equate it the
definitely.
same way?
Yeah. Actually, the term that I wanted to bring was asemic writing. So a lot of my paintings that are very gestural and so perhaps even calligraphic is a form of asemic writing. So it marks that could be a language and yet border on language and yet aren't a formalized language with syntax. Of course, that all goes back to the sense of origins that we have in making marks and language in a primordial sense. We can imagine that the first image that our forebears saw were handprints and footprints in the fluvial sand on a beach, or in mud, or a wet hand on a rock. So you see a palm print or a wet hand on a cliff face. And then that leads to a sense of, well, I can make that mark so more permanent with something other than water that evaporates. So it is again that bringing of the body into being and an assertion ultimately of a kind of register that we are here, we're mortal, but we intend to be immortal. Well, that's going somewhere else too.
Well, it's the intent of painting, I guess, right? Your paintings will long surpass your life,
But
right?
there's the intention, you see, so you don't want
Yeah.
to be intentional about it. But in terms of making the Echo's Bones paintings, I was trying to find a way of making these ones so that I wasn't merely reliant on brush mark, and then I was finding ways of foiling, laying down of the brush, and foiling ways of knowing what the painting would look like in the end. So
Gotcha.
finding a way of making the painting so that I would have no idea what it would look like when I strip off the tape and everything.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, before I get into the question I want to go back a bit in terms of when you start a series for your new series coming up, or even Echo's Bones. Did you intend to start something like that, or do you let it evolve in the first few paintings until it really comes to life, and that's when you start, for lack of a better word, naming things and
Yeah.
creating a sense of continuity?
Yeah. Both things happen, of course. Sometimes you really know the direction you want for a particular body of work, and you're able to get into it and develop it and stick to it. Sometimes it takes a drastic turn and it goes somewhere else, and that's also what you have to be open to. Did I know? I think The Echo's Bones, I knew that title from the beginning. I knew that. I had all the canvases prepared beforehand. I knew how many I wanted to make, and I set out to do that. But of course, within those strictures and then the foils that one sets up, then you're always, again, through observation, discovering something from each painting that can be used and developed in the next one, and then that one developed and used in the next one. It's something that I learned from very early on from Stanley William Hayter when I studied printmaking in Paris at the Atelier 17. He taught a process of looking and of printmaking that he called development by transformation. I won't go into the whole details of how the pedagogy at Atelier 17, but I realized decades later that it left a big imprint on me. And basically it is that you want to take any given piece or any kind of gesture you make in a given painting and then transform it and counterpoint it with the next, until you can no longer counterpoint the gestures themselves. And that's one of the things I had to learn in the printmaking process is, how do you counterpoint the entire field? That is, transform, for example, black marks on a white ground into white marks on a black ground. And that's a conceptual but proprioceptual exercise as well.
That's pretty cool.
And at the beginning, when you're challenged with that exercise, it's not easy to accomplish. We literally do spend months staring at a blank plate. Or no, not a blank plate, a very full plate, actually. But that's what happens in a set of paintings, is that you counterpoint within, but then one painting counterpoints the other, and you're always transforming what you're doing from one to the other as far as you can, until you run out of steam, you run out of ideas, or basically what happens with me, I just get bored because I know how to do it now.
Okay.
And if I know how to do it, I'm not interested in doing it anymore. If I'm not being put in a position that I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know how to do what I'm doing, then I'm not interested in it.
You like that challenge, right?
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
has to be a challenge. I mean, it has to be, it has to be life or death. In other words, you're having to invent the painting every time,
Mm-hmm.
and reinvent the way in which you paint every time.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot rely on what you already know. Of course, the fact is you do. And you rely on everything you've learned, and that all begins to feed back in and go ahead, again, to push you to a place where you have to make a new beginning.
Yeah.
If you're lucky.
So I guess in a rudimentary way, each series is built on the previous series, because without that series, you wouldn't be where you are currently.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And, and in a way, you get the sense now at where I am that the accumulation of what you've done is, again, in a kind of a dialogue with itself, that, a painting from tomorrow is going to be speaking to a painting done 20 years ago. And no matter how different they look on the surface, or how different the palette might be, that it's all in a dialogue with itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. In an email, you sent me a shot of some of your recent works. May I share those?
Sure.
Okay, because I do have a question about them. These are now following your last exhibit that we talked about, Echo's Bones. But, in some sense, to me...
These weren't in the show, no.
Oh, weren't they? No, they weren't in the show, but so these are some of the recent ones that you sent,
yes,
right?
Recent ones, yeah.
But I mentioned your previous exhibit because to me, it almost seems like a continuance. Now that you mention what you're saying, they have that same reminiscence. They don't have the text on them, but I still feel
actually, these ones do have a text, but you just can't see them.
Oh, there you go.
You can in the second one, but in the first one is really invisible. Second one is fairly visible. The third one is, yes, you can't see it. And then in the fourth one, it's there, but it's not there.
Yes, so they're sublayers.
It's very simple. It's earth, air, fire, water.
Oh, see, now I got to look for them. Yeah.
So it's the Heraclitan elements.
Yeah. So when
you're right. These are reminiscent of a set of 4 that were in the Echo's Bone show, because they are the same dimensions, 40 by 36 each.
Mm.
They are a quartet. And whereas the previous ones could be joined together to make a quadriptych, these ones can't. These have to remain separate. And the other ones will probably remain separate anyway. These ones have a completely different focus. The ones in the Gallery Jones show, that of course different text in them, but these ones are very specifically, I realized as I was doing them, that they were really a register, as I mentioned on it, or phrased it on the Instagram page. They're meant to register my affection and admiration for Tom Thomson. So they're called Canoe Lake 1 to 4. And Canoe Lake is, of course, the lake in Algonquin Park where Thomson painted, and finally where he died, where he drowned. And I've always been deeply in love with plein air painting, and in particular, the plein air painting of Tom Thomson. And when you have the encounter with those 8 by 10 things that are just packed with power and intensity, it really is something.
Nice. And I guess this also brings us back to the previous question about being exhausted when you're complete, when you finish the painting. But in a sense, and I guess every artist gets this, but how do you know you're complete, especially given all the layering that is available to you, or has their potential for layering?
Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't.
Okay, so you just look at it and you feel a sense of
Well,
complacency, and
and
it's good.
sometimes you'd like it to be complete, and you don't feel like doing anymore, and yet you're dissatisfied. You
Mhm.
ask yourself, "Can I get away with this one? Can I squeak this one
Can
by?"
I get away with it? That's funny.
And then something tells you, shit, you can't squeak this one by. You got to go back and work on it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then take the risk of losing it all, and you do sometimes lose it all. Sometimes my wife tells me,
Oh,
she says, don't touch this one, you know.
yeah. Well, every artist
Oh.
needs that, right?
And sometimes I listen to her, and sometimes I don't.
That's so funny. Now, is there any time that you leave it like you have this sense of angst that you need to do something more, but you leave it anyway?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that you can't really figure a way out. It is what it is, and it's probably a piece of crap, and you just let it sit there, and I'm going to begin to go through all my stacks and destroy everything that I don't think is worth keeping,
Hmm.
or I'm going to repaint them. I'm going to pull a shed book, and I'm going to and maybe I'll just camouflage them. I'll just cover them with white house paint, and then let anybody else who wants to figure out what's underneath there. And maybe I'll hide some hidden text in there, turn it into an excavation project for some poor grad student.
There you
500
go.
years
Yeah,
from
yeah. Oh, that's so funny. That's funny. What's your favorite part of creating? Is it, the start, the middle when you're really into it and it's just flowing, or the end when it's finally completed and you're exhausted and you can relish in the final piece?
Well, you go through whole kinds of emotions about it, and feelings about it. At the end of the day, any given painting day, you can be either totally depressed or totally exhilarated. And then, of course, we all have the experience of being totally exhilarated. You go have dinner, you have a glass of wine. I really nailed it. I got something good here. And you wake up in the morning and you realize it's shit, and you have to start all over again. So, I mean, it's the whole spectrum of it. There's no one thing that works. All I know is that we're very lucky to be able to be doing what we're doing. We're really blessed. We obviously really need to be grateful for this opportunity on this earth to be able to engage in this way and fulfill our lives in this way. And then when you feel sorry for yourself, or more noble, you think, oh God, I'm doomed, I have to do this. But I always hate that thing when you tell people that you're a painter, and I try not to. We're on an airplane. If people are talking to your wife, and I say, don't tell them what I do. I don't want to talk about this shit. It's just awful. But when they hear, aren't you lucky? You
Hmm.
get to paint and do what you want. Oh no, it's not what you want to do. I mean, you think of Matisse, who said, he looks at a blank canvas, and all he wants to do is go out and strangle somebody.
Hmm.
And I mean, and you feel that way sometimes, that it's, gee, I have to drag my ass in here and be disciplined and do it, because you don't always want to do it. You'd rather ride your bike or go hiking or
Yeah, absolutely.
or
Absolutely.
whatever. But in the end, it is, a blessed thing to be able to do. So yeah, but you have to accept the full spectrum of
Yeah.
what it involves. It's not pure joy, nor is it pure misery.
No, very much so. And it's so reassuring that after 6 decades, you still go through those moments where it's just all crap. And I just love hearing experienced painters tell me that.
Oh, yes, definitely.
It's almost as if the more you paint, the more difficult it becomes, right?
It is, it's true, and my favorite story about this is when I was at the Atelier 17 in Paris, and that's an international school. I mean, you have artists at various stages. I mean, accomplished artists, mature artists, as opposed to raw beginners as I was at that time, from all over the world. And being from Canada, the familiarity with Canadian art then as now is pretty low. And when I saw that there was going to be an exhibition of Riopelle at a Paris gallery, I forget which one now, I thought, well, I have to take all my colleagues from the Atelier 17, especially the European and UK people, never heard of Riopelle, to the show. And of course, I'm 21 years old and I'm a great, expert on Riopelle, and I know everything there is about Riopelle, and because I've, been really immersed in it. And I look at the show and I say loudly to my friends, "Oh, he hasn't progressed at all. This is all the same old stuff." So I mean, talk about being arrogant and
No
stupid.
doubt, eh?
Yeah, and especially as I'm trying to, introduce my friends to him, rather than say, "Oh, look at Riopelle. Look at me. I know more than Riopelle." This very tall gallerist leans over me, and I've told this story many times. And he says in French, "C'est facile d'avoir du génie à 20 ans. C'est difficile d'avoir du talent à 60 ans." It's easy to be a genius at 20. It's tough to have talent at 60. And now that I'm in my 80s, it's even tougher. So, and he was right, and I
Yeah.
instantly was ashamed and realized, what a little idiot I was.
Yeah. Life
Yeah.
lessons like that help you grow, right? You
Oh,
realize that you're not
yeah,
this,
of course, I've never forgotten it, and
obviously. Yeah.
proud to share my shame.
That's excellent. A question came in. Do you ever exhibit your poetry along with your paintings?
Well, yeah, I have, but it's a particular set of things called journal drawings. They
Mm.
were exhibited first in Toronto at the BP Nicol, the great Canadian poet and good friend, arranged an exhibition of them at the University of Toronto. I forget which campus now. And they were exhibited once when I was with the Atelier Gallery here, and I refused an exhibition of them at the Vancouver Art Gallery out of false modesty, and I should not have said no. I should have said yes. But these are very particular sets of texts and drawings done with felt pen ink on parchment paper that I did for a year. I did nothing but these. And these will all go into my archives at SFU in the Contemporary Literature Collection, because they're too fragile. They're to really be exhibited. But in terms of and then there are prints that I've done that have text and an image, the Requiem Notations prints, and they've been exhibited at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and they, of course, they're in their collection and in several other museum collections as well. But yeah, so yeah, I have exhibited poetry with painting with images.
Nice. So even though you refused the Vancouver Art Gallery once, they still allowed you back in, eh?
Well, it was Roy Kyoka who offered me to curate the show, and that was very sweet of him.
Mm.
But it was a particular moment in my life, and I was really depressed, so I didn't think there was much future.
Yeah, depression plays an evil role in our lives, doesn't it?
Yeah, artists tend to be prone sometimes to this, black dog.
Yep. Only makes us grow, though. Here's a pretty in-depth question. Could you please talk about your early years as a painter and a poet, as such things you enjoyed and struggles you faced, and what your perception of your future as an artist was, and how it has changed?
Well, that's a very good question, and of course, that's a big span to
Mm.
think about. In one way, I was very lucky and very unlucky when I was a young poet in Montreal, because my poetry was taken up very quickly by Louis Dudek, the great modernist Canadian poet, part of that whole group of poets that opened up Canadian poetry and literature to the 20th century. Irving Layton, Louis Dudek, Earl Burney, D.G. Jones, A.J.M. Klein, a whole host of poets that were very important in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And so I had a very, very important professor at McGill, Dr. H.G. Files, with whom I also did creative writing. And my classes with him were actually just tutorials, him and me. And I would write poems and bring them into his office and read them to him. And then he would just talk about literature. And I would sit there stunned at my own ignorance and not understand very much of what he was saying. But Dr. Files and Louis Dudek conspired behind my back to put together a manuscript of my poems and published it in the McGill Poetry Series as the 7th in the series. Leonard Cohen's was the first in the series, and mine was the 7th. It was supposed to be the last, but there was a straggler after that, or two, I forget how many. I mean, when you have a book of poems published in a series like that, I think they published it in an edition of 800 copies, which even today would be a big publishing run. That was 1964. You were guaranteed to reach all 200 people in Canada that were interested in contemporary poetry. So at a very early age, I was launched in a way at a level that I wasn't ready for.
Wow.
And so it took me a long time, to destroy my ego as much as I could. It's still in the process of being destroyed, and then rebuild. And so early success is not often a very good idea. But nevertheless, after that, it's still a struggle, especially as a painter. So I didn't have that kind of easy entry into the world of art as I did into the world of poetry. So I still, even though some people may think mistakenly that I'm part of the establishment or that I'm quote unquote a success, I don't feel that kind of thing at all. I feel that I have, there's nothing to sit upon. There are no laurels. There's, you always have to pay your dues, and you have to pay your dues every day. And nothing is guaranteed, and nothing is given. And so you just work. That's it. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think that's a great answer regardless. I mean, you just work and get it done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Change of direction here. I'm just curious about how you work in the studio in terms, like we saw those 4 recent works put up. Do you work on one piece at a time, or you're going to be doing 4 or 6 or 8, and they're sort of all in the go and each of them speaks to each other at the same time? So you're constantly painting in between paintings.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah. I tend to like to work on at least 2 pieces at once.
Oh, that's it, eh? Okay.
Yeah. 2 or 3 at once, depending on the size. So like the 4, I would start them all at the same time. But then with these ones, I determined that I would work on one at a time after the first layer. And so that's what I did. In fact, the first one was the last to be finished.
Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, because when you're working with oil, those layers need time to dry. And sometimes it takes over a week for a layer to dry. And so you need to be working on something else while another layer is drying. So yeah, it helps to keep things, in movement. And so you're not just sitting around watching the paint dry, although you do an awful lot of that anyway. At least 2 at a time.
Okay, and that's interesting that you started all 4 at the same time, but now that you talk about the process of letting layers dry, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Start all 4, continue one alla prima, put that aside, start the next one, continue on, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah, and you're right. I like that term, alla prima. It's a series of alla prima, stages of, separate stages of alla prima. Yeah, all at once.
Yeah.
I used to work on one painting at a time, and couldn't. It was really tough because I had to do the whole painting in one day, and I would scrape off paint and then repaint and scrape off and repaint and scrape off and repaint, and do it all in one day, all in one sitting. So you'd have marathon, especially when you're doing something 100 inches by 90 inches.
Yeah.
Like you're working 10, 12 hours nonstop. And then I realized, I can't do this anymore, I got to find another way of doing it. I've got to be able to, take stages. I have to be able to sit back. I can't always be trying to finish a painting in a single day.
I can't even imagine the angst that must cause. You're scraping off for a reason because you just don't like it. And then that feeling
Yeah.
of dread, and then trying to build it up, and then
Oh,
another
yeah.
feeling of dread.
Yeah. Yeah. It's,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Not only to
But
mention
it's an
the,
interesting way
yeah.
of working.
Oh, without a doubt.
I had observed some of my fellow painters, and like they could have something on an easel, and I've never painted on an easel, and they could put a brush stroke down one day, walk away, and 2 days later come back and put another few brush strokes. I thought, gee, what a wonderful way of painting, so relaxed. How can you be so bloody relaxed? Where's your sense of urgency?
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
so funny.
for me, it has to be urgent no matter what.
Yeah. At least you've learned to step away, stop, come back to it later, right?
Yeah.
Well, and for me, I don't know, maybe it's my practical sense. When I hear you just scraping all this paint away, all I can think of is the money that must be involved in that. You must be scraping up hundreds of dollars worth of paint.
Oh yeah, yeah. You're
Gee.
wasting a lot of paint, and I hate wasting paint. There's no question.
Do you find you can keep on using it?
I find ways of reusing paint now because all the paperwork is done with the leftover paint at the end of the day. And then that gets layered sometimes over months or years.
Okay, interesting. So when you say paperwork, you mean the smaller.
Yep, the stanzas, the smaller work on paper, the oil on paper, whether it's the Arches oil on paper or the prepared Arches aquarelle,
Gotcha.
you so I find a lot of use for the paint, and try not to waste anything.
I like how you said stanzas. I like how that it turns the smaller ones kind of into a series or an interpretation. I like that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's right.
and then do you find these smaller works not just inspire you, but are equal in themselves that they can now be enlarged? Do you ever do that?
Only done that. I've only done that once, and that was from one of a small collage that I put up on my Instagram, and everybody
Hmm.
liked. And so I thought, well, let's see if I can translate that. No, because I don't work from sketches, I don't work from drawings, I don't work from a priori images, by and large. So no, I don't do that scaling up. But it's an interesting idea, and I've often toyed with it.
Hmm.
And I even once got one of those projector things. I thought, gee, there's certain images that I like, just project the damn thing.
Yeah,
It's so bloody tedious. I can't do that. Bored the hell out of me.
I can imagine. I can see that thing going in the alleyway 12 hours later.
Oh, I took it back to Opus. I got a refund.
There you go. Oh, that's so
They
funny.
took it back, thank goodness.
That's awesome. So that's interesting that you took a series that some people liked and tried to enlarge them. How'd that go though? Did they end up like the smaller versions, or are they a creation unto themselves separately?
Creation on their own. It
Okay.
ended up going somewhere else, and yeah, but it gave me the basic architecture. So yeah, and I could exploit that more in the future, and I may, just to take the architecture from a small collage and then work from that.
But did you enjoy it as much as the way you paint currently and just immerse yourself into these
A little
pieces?
bit of a different challenge.
Oh, okay, yeah. Where you're always looking for that
Yeah, yeah,
challenge, that difficulty, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. Here's an interesting question in terms of presentation. For your works on paper, how do you display them? I believe that one behind you, is that on paper?
Yeah, that's paper. That's a fairly large one on paper. That's oil on paper, and that's a printmaking paper. But I prepare the paper with PVA, polyvinyl acetate,
Oh,
gamma
interesting.
PVA. So if you're not using the Arches oil paper and you want to paint oil on paper, then you have to prepare it with PVA. And I usually do 2 coats both sides.
Both
And
sides. Interesting.
yeah, both sides. Although these ones, then I think I only did one side. Anyway, they're not buckling, but you have to seal that paper before you can paint with oil on it.
That makes sense. Now, do you
Yeah.
bother throwing a little bit of a technical question? Do you bother throwing a ground on it, or you just go straight with the PVA?
No, I go straight with the PVA because the paper, I love the Arches paper. I mean, oil paint responds to paper so differently than it does to canvas
Huge.
or to board. Huge difference. And I just love the way paper takes the paint. It's a completely different luminosity and feeling from it. I just finished, 9 big pieces on paper, so it's been hard to get back to canvas now because it is such a different feel. So now I'm adapting back to canvas again. But the question was, how do you present them? Yeah, They get framed. The 30 by 22 get floated in a mat and then framed. And then the larger ones, because they're so large, there's no point in floating them in a mat. They just float in the frame.
Nice. So it's
That the
okay.
question? Is that?
Yeah, that answers the question, I believe. Thank you for that. Yeah, nice. Let's go to rejection throughout your life. As a young artist, well, it sounds like you got really lucky with your, no, I shouldn't say lucky, potentially lucky deservingly with your poetry. With your art, was it equal or is it a lot more rejection in terms of how you
Lots of
wanted to
rejection
take it?
and continuing rejection. I mean, I'm getting
Hmm.
rejected now, even, you know.
Well,
Uh,
that's fantastic for me to hear that
yeah,
because yeah,
yeah, live with it. We're all going to be rejected
absolutely.
day in and day out. Oh, Lord. Yeah, no, the other day I woke up, thinking, my God, damn it, why I'm not in this? Why am I not in that? And I'm feeling really down and depressed. I mean, nobody's paying attention to me right now. Poor me. Then I thought, just get up and get to work. Forget it. To hell with it. It doesn't matter. Oh no, I've had all kinds of humiliations. It's really extraordinary how cruel that art world can be, and then just how you just have to pick yourself up and tell yourself that, well, you're the only one that matters. They don't. What do they know?
Mhm. No doubt. Sounds like you got to put your CV by your bed so every time you wake up, you can see all your accomplishments, right?
Well, not a good idea to think that way. No, no, but it's true. None of us feel that we're getting the kind of attention we deserve or the
Mm,
sales we deserve. But the fact of it is that nothing is owed to us. We don't.
mm.
There's nothing that's guaranteed for us. Everything has to make its own way. You have to make your own way. Each painting has to make its own way. Each piece has to, get out there in the world and be loved or unloved. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a
It's an
great way to think about
embodiment
it.
of something that in a sense, has to be independent of approval.
Yeah, being humble and having the humility goes a long way, doesn't it? So,
Yeah,
in many sense, given your 6 decades of a lot of notable recognition, you don't really think you deserve the next notable recognition, then, right? You have to work for it and earn it.
you have to work for it. Yeah, it's always a struggle. I mean, we're all, gosh, looking for the next show, preparing for the next show, hoping for the next show,
Taking the next
for an
risk.
exhibition here or there. And, we all know that it takes years to plan in advance and that there are a lot of hurdles to get through. There are a lot of gatekeepers there. I mean, if you want me to talk about so-called success, right? We can quote Bob Dylan here or Beckett. He says, fail again, fail better, and that's pretty well all it is. But there's a Spanish artist, and I forget his name right now. He's a quite prominent conceptual artist. He had a big show at the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal that I was lucky to see. Very interesting installation. One of his avenues of investigation is the role of the artist in the contemporary world and how the artist and the art market interact and engage with each other, and what are the determinants, categorical determinants of quote unquote success. And so he analyzed it down to 5 things, he said, and into no particular order. Number one, you have to have the support of a private gallery. So can you tick that off? Okay. Number 2, you have to have a track record with curators and public galleries. Can you tick that off? Okay. Number 2. Number 3, do you have the recognition of your peers? I mean, are the contemporary artists in your immediate environs, supportive of you? Do they respect you? Does your work gain their attention? Can you tick that off? Do you get reviews and critiques in the art magazines or newspapers or what have you? Can you tick that off? Most of us can tick a lot of that off, right?
Like one for me. What are you
But
talking about?
the 5th one is collectors. And he says you have to have a minimum of 5 sustaining collectors. That is, who will collect your work in depth and support you. I mean, you look at the history of Matisse and Picasso. I mean, they really needed collectors, and those Russians really launched them, kept them going, kept them alive, put food on their table, paint in their, on their
Yeah.
palette, and canvas in the studio. So without the collectors, all those 5 things, but the collectors are ultimately one of the most important. And how many of us can say that we have 5 sustaining collectors? who will, collect you in depth.
Yeah.
Not easy. And then, so reviews. Okay, so I've had a lot of reviews, but do 10 reviews in the Vancouver Sun equal one review in the New York Times? I don't know. So,
Yeah.
there are worlds within worlds. You've
Very
read
true.
the 10
That's right. Yeah.
million, the $12 million shark?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes,
No,
so I
yeah.
mean, there's a lot going on.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. I'm gonna write those down when I edit this. That's a nice list. Now we're at the end, but I do have two questions for you. Hopefully they're different. And so, what's the best piece of advice you've been given? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, really, I don't think I ever had maybe what that French gallerist said to me was, in effect, a piece of advice,
Hmm.
like be humble. And I think that certainly has stuck with me. So perhaps we can cite that.
Oh, for sure.
But in terms of advice, you mean like career advice or how to paint or?
It's an open interpretation, and I think what
Yeah.
the French gallerist said to you had a huge impact on you,
Oh, yeah.
and it probably changed your way of thought, changed the way your ego, everything, right?
Well, it
So,
certainly knocked me down several pegs, and we all
yeah,
need to be knocked down.
yeah, for sure.
Uh,
I love that.
or at least some of us need to be knocked down. But other than that, I mean, I made it sound like I had easy early success with Louis Dudek and poetry in Montreal. The fact is that I was encouraged to send him my poems when I was around 15 or 16. And he wrote me back, and that letter is in my archives in SFU.
I can imagine.
And he said, "The road to good poetry is a long one. Perhaps you will continue on it." So that to me was a great piece of advice, because that perhaps just enraged me. And I said, "You son
Oh,
of a bitch, I'm going to continue down that road, whether you like it or not." The archness of the perhaps you will continue on it. I thought, God damn it, I'm going to continue on that. No one's going to
interesting.
stop.
I wonder if he chose his words really carefully in that sense, right?
Well, I guess he did.
Perhaps.
And I reminded him of that when he published my first book. And he just shrugged it off.
Oh, that's so funny.
I just wrote a letter to a young poet.
Trying to be encouraging. That's classic.
So it wasn't easy from the beginning,
Yeah,
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 you get challenged that way. And so every time you face a rejection or somebody says no to you, I think that is got to be something that you turn into you giving yourself permission to continue and not to accept the no. Who are they to tell you you are not who you are?
yeah, absolutely, right.
Who are they to tell you that you cannot practice what you want to practice? No one can tell you that. You can decide it like Rimbaud that, okay, I'm finished, I've done what I can do.
Mhm.
But otherwise, you can't accept anyone's dismissal.
Absolutely.
Ever.
Thank,
You have to be defiant.
yeah. And this kind of washes into the second question as well, which is what's your top piece of advice that you give others? And it sounds like you're pretty much talking about it right there.
Well, yeah, to go with what you believe in yourself to do. I
Hmm.
mean, my sense is that no matter which way we do paint, that we've all been given a set of instructions, and we all have something that we've been told to obey, and you have to make yourself your servant of that. And so, in that sense, it is something much, much larger than your individual accomplishment or what have you, because you're being obedient to something much, much, much larger to yourself. So, my sense would be, again, to say, yes, if you have that sense of that inner necessity and you have to be obedient to something, and you know that this is your way of being obedient, then just do it no matter what. Do not accept no.
I like that. Keeps you going.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Pierre. Wonderful interview. I really appreciate it.
Well,
And
thank you, Michael.
if everyone's interested in looking up Pierre online, he is at coupe.ca. And on Instagram, you can find his handle is Pierre Coupey. And if you want to find past interviews I've had on Artful Minds, you can go to community.artfulminds.ca. And with that, heartfelt thank you, Pierre. I hope we have many more conversations offline or even
Okay.
through email.
Yes,
It's been
definitely.
fantastic. I appreciate it. Thank you for everybody who attended. And until next time, take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for attending. Hope I didn't blather too much.
No, it was wonderful. I love it when people just talk. It makes my life so much easier.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy.